The morning after Thanksgiving, I found an envelope slipped under my front door. No name on it. Just my address written in Sarah's careful handwriting. Inside was a 3-page letter that began with the words, "You embarrassed yourself last night." My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading it. But not for the reason you might think. I'm 62 years old. 4 years ago, my husband David died of a sudden heart attack while raking leaves in our backyard in Boston. One moment he was there, complaining about the neighbor's oak tree dropping leaves on our side of the fence. The next moment, he wasn't. They told me he was gone before he hit the ground. That's supposed to be a comfort. It never has been. After David died, our house felt like a mausoleum. Every room whispered his name. The kitchen where he'd burn toast every Sunday morning. The living room where he'd fall asleep during every movie we tried to watch. The garage still smelled like his aftershave and motor oil. Our son Michael, our only child, had moved to Vermont 3 years before David passed, for a job opportunity and to be closer to nature with his wife Sarah. After 2 years of rattling around that empty house in Boston, I made the decision to sell everything and move to a small town about 20 minutes from them. A fresh start, I told myself. A chance to be close to the only family I had left. The town is called Fairfield. Population 3,000. The kind of place where the general store sells both groceries and fishing licenses, where everyone waves at everyone whether they know you or not. I bought a small Cape Cod-style house on Maple Street. How wonderfully Vermont is that, with a front porch perfect for morning coffee and a backyard that borders a maple grove. The leaves in autumn are spectacular. David would have loved it. I tell him about them sometimes, out loud, when I'm alone. Making friends at 60 isn't easy. I joined the local library book club, started volunteering at the Historical Society, took a watercolor class at the community center. Everyone was kind, but there's a difference between friendly and friends. That takes time. What I had plenty of was time with Michael and Sarah. Or so I thought. But I noticed something strange. Every invitation I extended seemed to be met with an excuse. They were busy. They had plans. Next week would be better. When we did get together, Sarah always seemed distant. Polite, but distant. Like she was performing the role of daughter-in-law rather than actually being one. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my loneliness onto their busy lives. They're young, well, younger. They're both 38, and they have careers and friends and lives that don't revolve around me. That's healthy. That's normal. But it hurt anyway. So when Thanksgiving came around, I decided to go all out. This would be my first major holiday hosting them in my new home. My first Thanksgiving without David would be behind me. Barely. It had been awful. Just me and a grocery store turkey dinner. And this year would be different. This year would be the start of new traditions. I spent 2 weeks planning the menu. I called Michael to ask about Sarah's dietary restrictions. Did she still eat red meat? Was she still avoiding dairy? He seemed surprised by the questions, said she ate everything, but I wanted to be sure. I wanted everything to be perfect. I cleaned the house until it sparkled. I bought a new tablecloth, cream-colored with embroidered autumn leaves. I made place cards with everyone's names in calligraphy, something I'd taught myself during those long, empty months after David died. I cooked for 3 days straight, turkey with herb butter under the skin, the way my mother taught me, mashed potatoes with cream cheese and roasted garlic, green bean casserole with the crispy onions on top, sweet potato casserole with the marshmallow topping, because David had loved it and it felt like keeping him at the table somehow. Cranberry sauce from scratch, none of that canned gel. Rolls from the local bakery because my arthritis makes kneading dough painful now. And 3 pies, apple, pumpkin, and pecan, because I couldn't decide which one David would have wanted most. Michael and Sarah arrived at 2 in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. The house smelled like a Norman Rockwell painting. Sarah brought a bottle of wine and a store-bought pumpkin pie, which made me feel a little guilty about my 3 homemade ones, but I thanked her warmly and put it in the kitchen. She looked beautiful, as always. Sarah has this effortless elegance, tall and slender, with dark hair she wears in a low bun, and these intelligent hazel eyes that seem to notice everything. She was wearing a rust-colored sweater and dark jeans, simple but perfect. Michael looked happy and relaxed, already loosening his belt in anticipation of the meal. We had wine on the porch first, despite the November chill. I'd put out a plate of cheese and crackers, and we wrapped ourselves in the plaid blankets I keep in a basket by the door. The maples behind the house were mostly bare, but a few stubborn leaves still clung to the branches, gold and crimson against the gray sky. It felt peaceful. It felt like family. During dinner, everything seemed to be going well. Michael praised every dish. Sarah was quieter, but she smiled and nodded and said the food was delicious. I found myself talking more than usual, filling the silences. I told stories about David, about the time he tried to deep fry a turkey for Thanksgiving and nearly set our garage on fire, about how he always insisted on wearing a ridiculous pilgrim hat during dinner, a cheap thing he'd bought at a costume shop, and how it made me laugh every single year, about how he'd start preparing his famous stuffing 3 days in advance, treating it like a top-secret recipe, even though I knew he just followed the recipe on the back of the bread cube bag with a few extra herbs thrown in. I'd brought out our old photo albums after dinner while we were waiting for our food to settle before dessert. I wanted Michael to see them, to remember his father, to remember the good times. There were pictures of David holding baby Michael in the hospital, both of them looking terrified. Pictures of family vacations to Cape Cod, David building sandcastles with 5-year-old Michael. Pictures of Michael's high school graduation. David's arm around his shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. Pictures of Michael and Sarah's wedding, David walking Sarah's father to his seat because her dad was on crutches from a skiing accident. David was good at things like that. Thoughtful, present. At one point, I found myself humming, then softly singing a song David and I used to sing together. It was Autumn Leaves, the Nat King Cole version. We'd danced to it at our wedding, and David had this tradition of singing it to me every Thanksgiving while we did the dishes together. I wasn't even aware I'd started singing until I noticed the silence around me. Michael was smiling, but it was a sad smile, his eyes a little glassy. Sarah had gone very still, her face unreadable. Then Sarah stood up abruptly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice tight. I'm very tired. I think we need to go." Michael looked surprised, glanced at his watch. It was only 7:30, but he didn't argue with her. He started gathering their things, apologizing, saying Sarah hadn't been sleeping well, that she'd been stressed at work. I walked them to the door, confused and trying not to show it. Sarah gave me a brief hug, the kind that doesn't really involve any body contact beyond shoulders touching. Michael's hug was warmer, longer. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered. Everything was perfect. But it hadn't been perfect. I knew that. I closed the door behind them and looked at my dining room table, still covered with half-eaten food and dirty dishes, the place cards sitting at each seat. The photo albums still open on the coffee table. The house that had felt so warm and full an hour ago now felt cavernous and cold. I'd done something wrong. I'd said something wrong, but I didn't know what. I cleaned up slowly, putting away leftovers, washing dishes, blowing out the candles I'd lit. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, trying to figure out where I'd lost them. Lost her. Because it was Sarah who'd wanted to leave. Sarah who'd gone rigid and silent. Had I talked about David too much? Was I one of those widows people warned about? The ones who can't stop living in the past? Was I embarrassing? I went to bed that night feeling like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. Like I'd revealed too much of myself and been found wanting. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the dark, in the house that still didn't quite feel like mine, and wondered if moving to Vermont had been a mistake. If trying to build a new relationship with my son and daughter-in-law was something I was simply too old, too damaged, too stuck in grief to accomplish. The next morning, Friday, I woke up early out of habit. The sun was just starting to rise, turning the sky that particular shade of pink that appears just before true morning. I made coffee and took it to the front porch, wrapped in my bathrobe and the same plaid blanket from the day before. The neighborhood was silent except for birds and the distant sound of someone starting their car. That's when I saw it. A white envelope on my welcome mat, right up against the door. I would have stepped on it if I'd walked out instead of sitting in the rocking chair. My name was written on the front in Sarah's handwriting. Nothing else, just Margaret. I picked it up with a strange sense of dread, like I was about to open my own verdict. Inside were 3 pages, front and back, covered in that same careful handwriting. And it began. "Dear Margaret, I need to tell you that you embarrassed yourself last night. and I need to explain why I'm the one who should be embarrassed instead. My first reaction was anger. Hot, sharp anger that made my face flush and my hands shake. How dare she? I'd spent weeks planning that dinner. Days cooking. I'd opened my home and my heart, and she was telling me I'd embarrassed myself? I almost crumpled the letter right there. Almost threw it away and decided I was done trying. But something made me keep reading. Maybe it was the second part of that sentence. I'm the one who should be embarrassed instead. The letter continued. What you did last night wasn't embarrassing. It was beautiful. And that's exactly why I had to leave. Because watching you honor David so openly, so freely, with such love and no shame, made me realize something about myself that I've been avoiding for 6 years. I'm a coward, Margaret, and seeing you be so brave made me feel more exposed than I've felt in years. I read that paragraph 3 times before I could move on. My anger was draining away, replaced by confusion and something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the first stirrings of understanding. Sarah's letter went on. 6 years ago, in October, my mother died. Her name was Catherine, though everyone called her Kate. She had a brain aneurysm in her sleep. No warning, no goodbye. She was 56 years old. The night before she died, we'd talked on the phone for an hour about nothing important. A recipe she wanted to try, a book she was reading, the weather. The last thing she said to me was, "Love you, sweet pea." That's what she always called me. Sweet pea. I said, "Love you too, Mom." And that was it. The next morning, my father found her in bed. She looked like she was sleeping. They told us she never knew what happened. Again, that's supposed to be a comfort. I could barely see the words now because my eyes were full of tears. I hadn't known. In all the time I'd known Sarah, 5 years since before she and Michael were married, she had never once mentioned her mother. Not once. I'd assumed her mother was alive somewhere, maybe estranged, maybe just not close. I'd never asked. How had I never asked? The letter continued, and I could hear Sarah's voice in every word now, could picture her sitting at her kitchen table, probably late at night, writing this out. Thanksgiving was my mom's favorite holiday. She'd start planning the menu in September. She'd make lists and check them twice, just like Santa Claus, she'd say. She'd test new recipes for weeks beforehand. The kitchen was her kingdom, and Thanksgiving was her coronation day. We'd cook together, just the two of us, the day before and the day of. My dad and my brother would get kicked out. Men underfoot, she'd say, shooing them away. It was our time, our tradition. Now I understood why Sarah had brought that store-bought pie, why she'd been so quiet in the kitchen while I cooked, why she'd seemed to disappear into herself during dinner. After she died, Sarah wrote, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't cook her recipes. Couldn't even talk about her without feeling like I was breaking apart. So I just stopped. I packed up all her recipes, all her cooking tools she'd left me, and I put them in boxes in our basement. I told myself it was too painful, that I needed time. But time passed, 6 years, Margaret, and I never took them out. I stopped cooking almost entirely. I stopped celebrating Thanksgiving in any real way. Michael and I would order Chinese food or go to a restaurant. Anything to avoid that kitchen, those memories, that pain. What must it have cost her, I thought, to come to my house yesterday? To smell turkey roasting and see a table set with love, and watch me do exactly what she couldn't do for her own mother? Last night, the letter went on, I watched you show every single person in that room how much you love David. You talked about him without flinching. You laughed at memories of him. You cried a little when you sang that song, and you didn't try to hide it. You pulled out photos and told stories and kept him alive in that room. And I felt so many things at once, Margaret. I felt admiration. I felt grief. I felt envy. God, I felt such envy. Not because you loved David, though it's clear you did, desperately, but because you had the courage to show it. I had to stop reading because I was crying too hard. I sat there on my front porch in Fairfield, Vermont, at 7 o'clock on the morning after Thanksgiving, with my coffee going cold beside me, and I sobbed. For David, for Sarah's mother, for all the ways grief makes us hide from each other when what we need most is connection. When I could see again, I continued. I've spent 6 years being afraid. Afraid that if I talked about my mom, I'd fall apart and never be able to put myself back together. Afraid that Michael had enough sadness dealing with your loss of David, and he didn't need my grief on top of it. Afraid that if I let myself feel how much I miss her, I'd drown in it. So I've been silent. And in that silence, I've dishonored her memory far more than you could ever dishonor David's by speaking his name. There was more. Sarah described her mother in detail, how Kate had been a high school English teacher who quoted poetry at random moments, how she'd worn her gray hair long and wild and didn't care what anyone thought, how she'd had the loudest laugh in any room, how she'd taught Sarah to cook starting when Sarah was tall enough to reach the counter standing on a stool, how they'd spent every Sunday morning together making elaborate breakfasts and talking about everything and nothing. When you started singing last night, Sarah wrote, I saw my mom so clearly. She used to sing while we cooked. Old show tunes, mostly. She had a terrible voice, but she didn't care. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd allowed myself to hear her voice in my memory. I've been so afraid of the pain that I've silenced her completely. I've made her death mean more than her life. And that, Margaret, is what's truly embarrassing. The letter ended with these words. Please forgive me for leaving abruptly. Please don't think you did anything wrong. You did everything right. You showed me what it looks like to love someone even after they're gone. You showed me that keeping their memory alive doesn't mean you're stuck in the past. It means you're honoring what they gave you. You taught me something last night, though you didn't mean to. You taught me that the real betrayal isn't crying or talking or singing or remembering. The real betrayal is silence. And I've been silent for far too long. I don't know if I can be as brave as you yet, but I'd like to try. With love and gratitude, Sarah. I must have read that letter 5 times that morning, sitting on my porch as Fairfield woke up around me. Cars started driving by. Neighbors came out to get their newspapers. Someone waved at me, and I waved back automatically, not even sure who it was. My coffee was ice cold. The sun was fully up now, bright and clear. One of those crisp November mornings that hurt your lungs when you breathe deep. I thought about all the times over the past year and a half that I'd interpreted Sarah's distance as dislike, her quietness as judgment, her busyness as avoidance. And all along, she'd been drowning in her own grief, trying desperately to keep her head above water, afraid that one wrong move would pull her under. How often do we do that? Assume the worst about someone's behavior when we don't know what war they're fighting inside themselves. I also thought about what I'd been doing since David died. Yes, I talked about him. Yes, I kept his memory alive. But I'd thought of that as weakness, honestly. As evidence that I couldn't move on, couldn't let go, couldn't be one of those strong widows who just keeps marching forward. The book club ladies in town, they'd all been so impressed by how well I was doing. How I'd sold the house, moved, started fresh. What they didn't see were the nights I cried myself to sleep. The mornings I forgot he was gone and called out to tell him something before reality crashed back. The way I still set 2 coffee cups out sometimes out of pure habit. But Sarah saw something else in my grief. She saw courage. She saw love that death couldn't diminish. She saw permission to feel what she'd been afraid to feel. And that changed everything. I didn't respond to the letter that day, or the next. Not because I was angry or unsure, but because I knew words wouldn't be enough. Sarah had spent 3 pages being vulnerable with me, cracking herself open and showing me her broken places. I needed to meet her there. I needed to show her that her honesty had been received, understood, honored. On Sunday morning, I called Michael. Just Michael. I need you to do something for me, I said. Ask Sarah if she'd be willing to have lunch with me on Tuesday. Just the 2 of us. Tell her it's important, but she's not in trouble. Tell her... I paused, choosing my words carefully. Tell her I'd like to talk about our mothers. There was silence on the other end. Then Michael said quietly, She told you about her mom. He sounded surprised, maybe even shocked. She never talks about her mom. Not even with me, really. She wrote me a letter, I said, and I'd like to respond in person. Michael called back an hour later. Sarah said yes, Tuesday at noon. I could come to their house or she could come to mine, whichever I preferred. I suggested their house. Neutral territory, I thought. A place where she felt safe. Monday was spent preparing. I went down to my basement where I'd stored some boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. Things I'd brought from Boston that didn't have a place in this new, smaller house. I found what I was looking for in the third box I opened, David's recipe collection. He'd kept everything in a battered wooden box his own father had made, recipe cards and torn magazine pages and notes scribbled on napkins, all jumbled together in no particular order. His stuffing recipe was in there, his barbecue sauce formula, his world-famous, his words chili that was really just something he'd cobbled together from 3 different recipes he found online. I also went to the craft store and bought a blank recipe box. Dark wood, simple, beautiful. And I bought divider cards and blank recipe cards, the old-fashioned kind with lines for ingredients and instructions. Tuesday morning, I woke up nervous. I dressed carefully. Nothing too formal, but nicer than my usual flannel and jeans. I wanted Sarah to know I was taking this seriously. I put David's recipe box and the new empty one in a canvas bag, along with a plate of the leftover pecan pie from Thanksgiving. At 11:30, I drove to their house. Michael and Sarah live in a renovated farmhouse about 5 miles outside of town, surrounded by fields and forest. It's beautiful in that rustic Vermont way. White clapboard, green shutters, a red barn that they use as a garage. Sarah answered the door before I could knock. She looked nervous, too. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like maybe she'd been crying that morning, or maybe she just hadn't slept well. I knew that look intimately. "Hi," she said softly. "Come in." Their house was warm and smelled like wood smoke from the fireplace. She'd set the table in the kitchen, a small round table by the window that overlooked their back field. 2 place settings, 2 glasses of water, a vase with the last of the season's chrysanthemums in the center. She'd made soup, she said, butternut squash, and there was bread from the bakery in town. We sat down, and for a moment neither of us knew how to begin. The soup sat between us, steaming. Finally, I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the 2 recipe boxes. I set them on the table between us. "This one," I said, putting my hand on David's old battered box, "was my husband's. This one," I touched the new box, "is for your mother." Sarah stared at the boxes, then at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought," I continued, "that maybe we could spend today doing 2 things. First, I want to hear about your mother. Her name was Kate, you said in your letter. I want to know about her. I want to know what she loved, what she cooked, what made her laugh. I want you to tell me stories about her the way I told stories about David. And second," I opened the new recipe box. It was empty except for the divider cards, which I'd labeled appetizers, main dishes, sides, desserts, Kate's favorites. "I thought you could start filling this. We could start bringing her recipes up from your basement, making her real again, making her present." Sarah was crying openly now, not the kind of crying where you try to hide it or apologize for it. Just tears streaming down her face while she looked at that empty recipe box like it was the most precious thing she'd ever seen. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "What if it hurts too much?" "It will hurt," I said. "Grief always hurts. But Sarah, silence hurts too. I know you know that. You've been carrying that silence for 6 years, and it's been crushing you." She nodded, wiping her eyes with her napkin. I thought if I didn't talk about her, if I just kept moving forward, eventually it wouldn't hurt anymore. But it never stopped hurting. It just got quieter, deeper, like a wound that scabs over but never actually heals. "I know," I said. "I know exactly what you mean." We ate our soup slowly, and as we ate, Sarah started talking, hesitantly at first, then with increasing confidence. She told me about how Kate had taught English at the local high school for 30 years, how she'd been the kind of teacher students remembered decades later, the one who made them love reading even if they'd hated it before, how she'd had an extensive collection of vintage brooches and wore a different one every day, how she'd grown tomatoes in her backyard every summer and made sauce from scratch every fall, enough to last the whole year. She had this ridiculous apron, Sarah said, and she was laughing now through her tears. Bright yellow with red cherries all over it. It was hideous. My dad tried to throw it away at least a dozen times, said it hurt his eyes. But she loved it. She wore it every time she cooked. She said it was her superhero cape. "What happened to it?" I asked. "The apron?" It's in one of those boxes in the basement, Sarah said quietly, with her recipes and her favorite wooden spoon and the cookbook her mother gave her. Would you show me? I asked. After lunch? She hesitated, then nodded. We finished eating, and Sarah led me downstairs. Their basement was unfinished but dry and organized. In one corner were 3 medium-sized cardboard boxes, stacked neatly, labeled in Sarah's handwriting, Mom's Kitchen. We carried them upstairs to the dining room table. Michael had left for work that morning. This was intentional, I realized later. He'd given us this space, this time. Opening those boxes was like opening a time capsule. The apron was on top of the first box, carefully folded. Sarah pulled it out and held it up. And yes, it was hideous. Bright yellow, red cherries, and it was also clearly well-loved. Faded from washing, a small stain near the pocket that hadn't come out, one tie slightly frayed. Sarah pressed it to her face and breathed in deeply. I don't know if it still smells like her, she said, but I imagine it does. Underneath were the recipes. Some were on proper recipe cards, neatly written. Others were torn from magazines, margins filled with Kate's notes. Add more garlic. Too bland, needs paprika. Sarah's favorite. There were recipes from food blogs, printed out and splattered with ancient sauce stains. There was a whole notebook dedicated to Thanksgiving dishes, each page a different year, notes about what worked and what didn't, modifications and experiments. We spent the entire afternoon going through those boxes. Sarah read recipes to me, told me the stories behind them. This one was what Kate made every year for Sarah's birthday. This one was the first recipe Kate had taught Sarah to make by herself when she was 8 years old. Chocolate chip cookies, the recipe so splattered and worn it was barely legible. This one was Kate's mother's recipe, and her mother's before that, passed down through 4 generations. I'm going to teach you some of these, I said, if you'll let me. And you're going to teach me. We're going to cook together, and we're going to keep them both alive. David and Kate. We're going to talk about them and laugh about them and cry about them, and we're not going to be embarrassed. Sarah looked at me with such gratitude, such relief, that I felt my own tears starting again. Why are you doing this? She asked. Why are you being so kind to me after I left your house like that? Because, I said, you gave me a gift. You told me that loving David out loud, refusing to hide him away, was brave. I've felt so foolish sometimes talking about him, keeping his memory alive. People look at me with pity, or they change the subject, or they tell me I need to move on. But you saw something different. You saw love, and you shared your own grief with me, which took enormous courage. We're not that different, you and I. We're just 2 women who lost people we loved, trying to figure out how to keep living. We made a plan that afternoon. Once a month, Sarah and I would cook together. We'd alternate. 1 month, something from David's collection. 1 month, something from Kate's. We'd make it a tradition. Michael could join if he wanted, or it could be just us. A space for grief and memory and love. A space where silence wasn't required. That first month, we made Kate's Thanksgiving stuffing. Not on Thanksgiving, that felt too big, too soon, but on a random Wednesday in December. Sarah wore her mother's apron. I brought David's old wooden spoon. We cooked in Sarah's kitchen, and we talked about our people. I told her about David's terrible jokes, the ones that made me groan and laugh at the same time. She told me about how Kate would dance while cooking, spinning around the kitchen with a wooden spoon as a microphone. We cried. We laughed. We burned the butter and had to start over. The stuffing turned out pretty good, not perfect, but good enough. Michael came home while we were cleaning up. He stopped in the doorway and just stared. Sarah was wearing the yellow apron, her eyes red but her smile genuine. I was drying dishes at the sink. The kitchen smelled like sage and celery and onions. You're cooking, he said to Sarah, and his voice broke a little. You're cooking Mom's recipes. Margaret's helping me remember, Sarah said simply. Michael looked at me then and mouthed the words, "Thank you." I just nodded. That was 8 months ago. Since then, we've cooked together every month. We've made David's famous chili and Kate's pot roast. We've made David's experimental pizza dough and Kate's apple pie. We've made mistakes and messes and memories. We've brought up both recipe boxes, and sometimes we'll just sit and go through them together, reading the notes and stains and stories held in those cards. Sometimes Michael joins us. When we cook David's recipes, Michael tells his own stories about his father. Things I never knew. Ways David had been there for him that I hadn't seen. It's expanded my understanding of my own husband, made him fuller and more real. When we cook Kate's recipes, Michael talks about his mother-in-law, whom he'd only known for 2 years before she died. How she'd welcomed him into the family immediately. How she'd taught him to make her signature marinara sauce. How she'd told him he was good enough for her daughter and she knew he'd take care of her. Other people have noticed the change. At book club, one of the women asked me recently if I seemed lighter somehow. I thought about that word. Lighter. Not because I've forgotten David or put aside my grief, but because I'm not carrying it alone anymore. Because I found someone who understood that grief isn't something to hide or overcome or be embarrassed about. It's something to live with, to honor, to weave into your new life without letting it strangle you. Sarah sent me a text message last week. It said, "Cooking Kate's butternut squash soup today. Making extra for you. Pick up whenever. P.S. I'm not embarrassed anymore." I texted back, "Neither am I." Here's what I learned from that Thanksgiving dinner and the letter that followed it. We're all so afraid of being too much. Too sad. Too broken. Too stuck in our grief. We police ourselves and each other, deciding what's appropriate to feel and for how long. We hide our broken hearts because we don't want to be burdens. We don't want to be embarrassing. But there's no shame in loving someone so much that their absence leaves a hole in the world. There's no shame in talking about them, remembering them, keeping them alive in the ways that matter. The people we love don't die completely as long as we carry them with us. As long as we tell their stories. As long as we cook their recipes and sing their songs and laugh at their jokes. That Thanksgiving, I thought I'd embarrassed myself. I thought I'd revealed too much, needed too much, felt too much. But what I'd actually done was create space for someone else to grieve out loud, to stop hiding, to start healing. And in doing so, I'd given myself permission to keep being exactly who I was, a woman who loved her husband deeply and refuses to pretend otherwise. This past Thanksgiving, 9 months after that letter, Sarah hosted. She cooked for 3 days straight, just like her mother used to. She used Kate's recipes and wore that ridiculous yellow apron. She set the table with care and place cards. She talked about her mother all through dinner, stories Michael had never heard, stories that made us laugh and cry. And after dinner, she brought out a photo album of Kate that I'd never seen before. At one point, she started singing, an old show tune I didn't recognize. She said Kate used to sing it while making pie crust. Her voice cracked and wavered, but she didn't stop. Michael joined in on the chorus. I didn't know the words, but I hummed along. And when the song ended, Sarah looked at me across the table and smiled. A real smile, a free smile. "Thank you," she mouthed. "But I'm the one who's grateful. Grateful for that letter that looked like criticism, but was actually an offering. Grateful for a daughter-in-law who was brave enough to be vulnerable. Grateful for second chances and new traditions, and the ways grief can connect us instead of isolate us when we let it. I'm 63 now. David has been gone for 4.5 years. And I still talk about him. I still sing our song. I still cook his recipes and tell his stories, and keep him alive in every way I know how. But now I do it with someone beside me who understands. Someone who's doing the same thing with her own ghosts. Someone who taught me that the opposite of grief isn't happiness. It's silence. And I'm done being silent. If you're watching this and you've lost someone, here's what I want you to know. Don't be embarrassed. Don't hide your love because you're afraid of being too much or taking too long or not moving on fast enough. The people who matter will understand. And the ones who don't? Well, they haven't loved deeply enough yet to know what it costs. Talk about your people. Cook their recipes. Sing their songs. Let yourself cry and laugh and remember. Because that's not weakness. That's not embarrassment. That's love. And love doesn't die just because someone does. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear about the person you're remembering today. Drop their name in the comments below. Let's fill this space with love and memories instead of silence. And if you want more stories about life, love, loss, and finding your way through it all, please subscribe. Sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us we're not alone.